We see David Hale is in the green room. We'll welcome him in right now. David Hale, ESPN.com, college football writer and friend of the program, and certainly somebody who was here covering Florida State for many years. David, I don't know what you could hear of just a moment ago, but I wonder too, first of all, welcome in, good sir. Secondly, I'm curious, do you think in addition to making a public proclamation that Florida State is no longer going to remain silent, that it was also perhaps a message to the other members of this conference that now is the time for action, that now is the time to seek higher ground if, in fact, you realize that at the end of the day, this is a conference that may very well be dissolved in the not-too-distant future?
Yeah, I think more than anything, this was a message to the other ACC programs. I mean, presidents and ADs at the other schools that have held up some of these conversations, particularly surrounding revenue sharing. I mean, there's an immense amount of frustration, not just at Florida State, but within, I think, you could probably add certainly Clemson, Miami, North Carolina to that conversation of saying, like, look, the fact of the matter is what we're doing now isn't working. This isn't necessarily a panacea here. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a step. I had one AD tell me, like, I don't think that changing the revenue structure is necessarily going to fix all our problems, but there's a principle behind this. The principle is, like, the football schools have to get more revenue to compete at football, and football is bringing a benefit to everyone in this league. And frankly, this has been part of the problem with the ACC for quite some time now. When Jim Phillips took over as commissioner, one of the first things that he put on his priority list is, like, I got to convince the rest of these damn schools to care about football as much as Florida State and Clemson and Miami do. That has been part of the problem. The divergent philosophies within the ACC are part of the problem. You look at the SEC, and it's easy to get stuff done there for the most part, while everybody has their own axis to grind. Almost to a man, they're all on the same page, and the few that aren't are just happy to ride the coattails. In the ACC, it doesn't work that way. You have probably at least two, but really three or four different factions of schools that have dynamically different interests and dynamically different philosophies on what their goals should be. So this is part of the problem, is convincing the rest of the folks that, like, look, what's a rising tide lifts all ships, and lately Clemson has been the only tide that's been rising. Florida State is at least in that conversation, and Miami has at least shown that over the last couple of years, at least, they're trying to get back there. So look, this is, to me, the message was as much to the rest of the league as it was to anybody else in or outside of the ACC. I think this was completely about, like, look, we're trying to play nice for now, but that can only happen for so long.
Ira, Gene, I'll give you a chance here in just 1 second. David, really quick on the heels of that, I wanted to ask you if you'd heard back from other perhaps administrators or people in a position of knowledge at these other schools as to what their thoughts were on what Michael Alford had to say. But also, big picture question, is this solvable? Are we talking about something that if people came to the table and suddenly agreed that football is king, it would work? Because I'm not so sure this is solvable.
Well, I don't want to give you a long answer to a pretty direct question there, but one, Alfred's comments didn't come as a surprise to almost anybody, and in fact, he had reached out to several other ADs beforehand to let them know that something along these lines was going to happen. So I think he is speaking without question. Everyone that I have talked to, and this was before Alfred's comments, have said Florida State has been by far the most aggressive in pushing a lot of this stuff, but there's plenty of others that are kind of happy to see Michael Alfred be the guy out in front taking the bullets for this, but they're 100% behind what he's saying. Is it solvable? I actually spoke with Jim Phillips today, and one of the things that he said is, like, there's not a magic bullet here. There is not a simple solution that, like, if we do this, everything gets fixed. But he is at least projecting an aura of confidence that if they can do maybe 5 or 10 different things, it can at least make things workable. And I genuinely don't know. I am not smart enough or privy to the inside information enough to know. But if you can add 3 million here and 2 million there and 5 million here, using different philosophies to get to that point, then maybe it's a sustainable thing. But look, frankly, the ACC is probably going to end up announcing somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million distributed per team for the last financial year. The new Big Ten agreement that's set to start in a couple of years is going to pay $80 million a year. And so we're not even talking about just, wow, $40 million a year. That's a big difference. $40 million a year over a decade, you're talking about close to $500 million. That's not fixable. But the other problem here is, and I'm sure you guys have touched on this, like when Alford says, like, well, hypothetically we could maybe get out for 120 million and that pays itself off in a few years. The grant of rights is not that simple. And even the best case scenario is going to be a protracted, ugly divorce. So if things go south, which I don't genuinely think anybody really wants that to happen if they can find a solution. But if things do, it's going to be long and ugly and unpleasant for all parties involved.
Ira, anything to add to that, sir?
Yeah, no, I agree with it. But, and I guess, David, I think a lot of us kind of are in the same mindset that this is a problem that's probably not fixable in the long term, because just one of the things you said earlier was when Jim Phillips came in as commissioner, he had to expressly convince all the other schools that football has to be first. I mean, think about that in 2020, 2021 or 2020, that the commissioner has to be saying that when football has been driving the bus financially in this country of college sports for 2 decades or more. So that, I think, is the root problem. But I guess my question to you would be, do you get the sense any of these schools might be willing to kind of make some minor steps to at least help Phillips get to where he needs to go? Because like you said, there's a lot of things that would need to happen that make it tenable in the short term. But do you get the sense any of these other schools are willing to try to make that happen even in the short term?
I think there's some energy from some schools. A school like Wake Forest, for example, which I think financially would certainly come out on the small end of things, has said, like, look, if there's going to be a revenue sharing agreement that largely rewards success on the field, we buy into that philosophy. Success should be rewarded. So, all right, yeah. Great. How does that, and look, and I've talked to ADs who have pointed and said, like, look, I understand that Florida State and Miami want more money. They've not done a really good job of spending the money that they currently have. Why should we give them more of our money? And that's a compelling argument if you want to make that argument. And the last part of that, and I think this gets to what you guys are saying, is you've got ADs and presidents who are looking at the math and saying, all right, I'll just go ahead and throw my hands up and give them what they want. And the end result is they get an extra $3 million a year, maybe. What does that buy me? Nothing. We're still going to be right back where we are. And in 3 or 5 years or 8 years, they're going to bolt the league anyway. What did that get us? Nothing. I caved for nothing.
Gene.
Yeah, David, I appreciate, first of all, a lot of good insight there. I'm just kind of curious how, I mean, you made a good point about how fractured this conference is when you compare it to, I don't know if we just lost David.
We'll try to get it back.
He did not want to hear my question. No, but I'm just like, my question is about the fragmented nature of this conference, and nobody in the Big Ten, the ACC, nobody's like, or the SEC, nobody's like, I'm sorry, there we go. David, got you back. I want to ask you again, you mentioned how fragmented this conference is, and I think it's so different than any other conference because you've got geographically so different, culturally, financially. Some sports are, some people are really into lacrosse at some school. Obviously, there's some blue blood basketball schools. Is there really any way that this group is going to be able to get on the same page? And aren't we just, if they do agree to some kind of revised revenue model, isn't this kind of just delaying the inevitable that this conference is going to fold, whether that's in 3 years or 10 years down the road?
Well, I think to your point on that, this is one of the reasons that people are worried, like, about agreeing to anything. Like, what's the point of agreeing if it's not going to get us anywhere that genuinely fixes things? I think what almost everybody wants to hear is a long-term solution, not short-term, Band-Aids on bullet wounds. I think that's part of the problem for both the so-called rich schools and the so-called poor schools. That why are we fighting over this when it's not going to fix the problem anyway?
Yeah, it's certainly understandable too. By the way, if I'm one of those small schools that perhaps is not even inclined moving forward to want to play big boy football, because I know I don't have the resources to do so, and it's not really aligned with our values. Why would I want to part with extra money right now to Clemson and Florida State when they're just going to leave the first chance they get? I'm going to shortchange myself in the near future for a group of people who don't want to be here to begin with and are going to leave the second they can? I get why the smaller schools would say no, and that's why I do feel like this is a fruitless discussion, that it is salve, if you will, on a gaping wound when we're talking about revenue sharing and more, obviously money going to the upper crust teams. I don't think it's going to solve anything. I guess I would ask a big picture question here, David. How realistic is it that Florida State and Clemson, and again, just from what you're hearing and what you think is possible regarding the grant of rights, how realistic is it that Florida State and Clemson are in the ACC 5 years from right now?
I will say I've talked to enough people who have kind of given me the indication that if we're talking about a realistic runway of at some point we reach a point of no return in which the money is so the delta on revenue is so problematic that we face an existential crisis, not just an inconvenience, but an existential crisis. And by and large, I would say that the average feedback that I get on that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 years. So I think that's probably a reasonable timeline we're talking about before something has to be addressed. One thing I will say, and I want to be a little careful about how I say this because I don't want to be viewed as speaking for the company that I work for or anyone that is having conversations at that level that are way above my pay grade. But I think one of the things that is sort of lost in this is that I hear from people all the time on social media who think that somehow ESPN is orchestrating all of this and wants to put Florida State and Clemson in the SEC. I don't think that's true at all. The fact of the matter is ESPN has a vested financial interest in maintaining the ACC as a solvent, profitable revenue generator for them. They are a 50% ownership stake of the ACC network. They don't want to see the ACC fall apart. At this point, I don't know that anyone at ESPN, or not that I have heard from any of the ADs or administrators that I've talked to, thinks like, we got to tear up this TV contract now, because it's not life or death today. But there may be a point where it is life or death for the ACC, in which the ESPN looks at the numbers everywhere else and says, look, we have an opportunity to make more revenue from the ACC by keeping it together somehow, by adjusting the TV contract or whatever, than we do by letting it fall apart. And there's an investment in the ACC's future from ESPN. And the other thing is, the way that sports are consumed, and particularly for ESPN, a larger and larger stake of what they are viewing as a revenue model is coming from ESPN Plus and over-the-top programming. And so you're filling content needs. All of these things are sort of a different conversation than what was had back in 2016 when this TV contract was first agreed to for a 20-year deal. And the other thing I do try to point out, and I've even had some ADs say, we don't talk about this, but it's true. There's ADs and school presidents on the job in the ACC today that had a hand in signing that 20-year deal back in 2016. And now they're all like, whoa, what a mistake that was. Well, it was kind of your mistake. So, a lot of these things, I think, I say 5 years. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable timeline to be talking about really true changes. And I also wonder, given what we talked about a potential protracted legal battle to get out of the grant of rights, if the ball has to get rolling on that timeline sooner than 5 years. But at the end of the day, I mean, we've seen a lot change just in the last 3 years. A lot can change in the next 3 years too. So I'm not necessarily willing to say I think it's going to happen. I think there's a likelihood something has to change though in that timeline.
Can I jump in here, Jeff?
Sure.
And by the way, thanks again, David, for joining us. The one question I had for you, and just because I think your perspective would be valuable, knowing more of the players around the conference than we do down here in Tallahassee. Two parts of this question. Number one, do you feel like there was a feeling that the 2017 extension, when they re-signed to extend the grant of rights to get the ACC network, did you get the sense there was confidence that actually could solve things? And then also when Jim Phillips came in, when Jim Phillips took the job, I thought, well, that's probably a good sign for the ACC. Like, he had to know what the situation was. Why would you take this job if it's as bad as it looks? And now it is as bad as it looks. So do you have any insight onto either of those? Do you think he was caught off guard a little bit? And do you think was there real confidence that the network would change things dramatically?
I mean, look, frankly, the network has helped things a lot.
Sure.
And one thing that we haven't seen yet is the network went to full distribution last year. So they're in the ACC network is available in as many homes as SEC network and Big Ten network is. There is money coming in that is substantial money from the ACC network for the ACC. And some of that hasn't been completely realized yet and will be. So I think so to answer your question, sort of two things. One, I think in 2017, the idea of a TV network was different than it is today. And that's for myriad reasons. And I don't blame people who are in positions of power in the ACC who are not TV people per se for not seeing the writing on the wall that the way that we consume these things was changing, because I don't know that any of us truly understood that. The idea of signing a 20-year deal, though, as much as that was sort of part of the devil's bargain that they had to make, I don't know how you look back at the previous 20 years of growth in TV revenue and say, yeah, we're all good with signing on board for another 20 years. That's just logic to me.
Yeah.
How much did Jim Phillips understand this coming in? I was in a room with him the day that the Texas and Oklahoma news broke. And I will say he was not happy at that time. I think you could kind of see on his face the reality of like, see that this is domino one, and just being able to project ahead the next 20 dominoes that fall and seeing what a predicament that was going to put him in the ACC in. And again, I don't know how many of us were predicting Texas and Oklahoma to go to the SEC when they did. So I don't necessarily blame him for not seeing that coming. And the other thing about Jim Phillips, and look, I think he's done a very good job. And again, talking to Michael Alford, he's not blaming Jim Phillips for any of this.
Right.
He's an old school university guy. I mean, he's come up through the NCAA, worked at Northwestern, like as an AD. Like the nuts and bolts for him are college athletics and amateurism and I think he gets like, I think, hit over the head for being kind of Pollyanna-ish about this stuff sometimes, but he truly believes it. And I think before 5 or 6 years ago, almost everyone in a position of power would have echoed the same things. But now George Kliavkoff and Greg Sankey and certainly Kevin Warren, and I would guess whoever will replace him, these are much more business savvy guys. These are guys who are looking at the bottom line. They are cutthroat. They are not concerned about the traditions of college sports the way that everybody else is. And I mean, you can have a valid argument about whether that's a good or a bad thing, but as you guys have said, it's just reality right now.
Yeah, David, it doesn't really matter if we think it's a terrible thing. There's no doubt Jim Phillips sounded like a man bereft of hope the moment he realized that his view, the traditionalist view of college football, had gone the way of the dodo. He sounded like that at the ACC kickoff, like a man who had, just lost his puppy. It was tragic. But the problem is now everybody saw that. Everybody watched that. They watched the commissioner looked as if we don't have an alternative other than to rely on others' good nature, the better angels of their nature, right? And that ain't going to happen. The SEC and the Big Ten have proven they don't care about what was. And it's an arms race, and it's one that the ACC can't win unless they restructure the contract. And ESPN wouldn't be in a hurry to restructure that contract, one wouldn't think. Is there any avenue by which the ACC would sue ESPN and say, if you don't restructure this, we can't compete? No, by the way, you're the ones that engineered all of this growth. You're the ones who engineered Texas and Oklahoma to go to the SEC. You know we can't compete.
Again, I want to be very careful about what I say because who the hell knows? I want to make sure my contract is honored.
Yeah, Jeff's doing a good job of putting you in a tough position there, David.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't necessarily have to come down to litigation because I don't think that behooves anybody. I think there is and would be a genuine interest in trying to find a solution. Now, it is certainly possible. Again, just speaking as an outside observer on how math works, that they would say, like, I can't give you SEC money. Ain't going to happen. You're not worth it. I mean, frankly, I think there would probably be some internal discussions today that says like, we're probably getting about what we should be getting out of the ACC, and they're getting paid more or less what they should be getting paid. You know, I said this the other day on Twitter, and I think this is ultimately where things fall is like, we can argue all we want about whether it's fair that Boston College and Florida State get the same slice of the ACC pie. The problem is we live in a world where Vanderbilt and Indiana get a much bigger slice of pie than Florida State or Clemson do. And, you know, I don't know that it's ESPN's job to fix that. I don't know that it's Jim Phillips capable of fixing that. It's just this weird scenario of what college football has been. And this, I think, is true of NIL. It's true of the transfer portal. It's true of all these other things. We're retrofitting a game that has been being played for more than a century now. And so much of stuff that was decisions that were made 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago still plays into this. I was on Feinbaum the other day, and when I got off just talking about this, and right before I got off, the last thing Paul says is like, remind your friends down there in Tallahassee that Bobby Bowden didn't want to be a part of the SEC when he had a chance. So I know Paul's job is to make some money for himself too. But I mean, look, the fact of the matter is decisions from a long time ago are still playing into this. And any outside viewer would rationally look at this and say, it's insane that Vanderbilt might get $80 million a year and Florida State gets 40. That makes no sense in any other world except for college football, where somehow we're just supposed to live with this.
Hey, David, real quick. I know we kept you for a long time. Really, we all appreciate it. You really offer some great insight here. And just back a little bit to the Jim Phillips thing. You keep bringing him up, and I keep seeing Jim Phillips to the Big Ten. You know, that's one of the guys that keeps being thrown out there rumors. And we talked about what message, if that happens, what message does that send to the rest of the conference? How these ADs going to respond? If you keep saying he's got to orchestrate all this stuff, and who's going to want this job if it opens up?
Yeah, what a great irony that would be if the final nail in the ACC's coffin was delivered by Jim Phillips. It's a great question. I will say, from the folks that I have talked to off the record, I would be a little surprised if it is Jim Phillips. Okay. I know he was sort of a finalist for that job when Kevin Warren got it. There were a lot of folks in power in the Big Ten at the time who thought it should have been him. Frankly, a lot of the dynamics surrounding the league have changed, and so a lot of the power players in the Big Ten have too. I would not be surprised if he has been discussed. I'd be a little surprised if he's the guy.
Well,
but I will say this though. I think that is a job to watch for the ACC too, because so much of like what's going to happen, as I've had a few ADs say, like, ain't nobody leaving the ACC until somebody else hands them an invitation to go somewhere better. And Kevin Warren was rattling some chains about, we're going to keep expanding, we're going to keep being aggressive. It'll be very interesting because I don't know that all of his membership agreed with that. It'll be interesting to see what the next guy's perspective is on how much the Big Ten needs to grow, because I think whether it's UNC, whether it's Miami, whether it's Florida State, having the Big Ten as a possible landing spot is really good for them if it's an opportunity.
Well, I just want to say, I think it would be great news if he did go to the Big Ten, because he would let us all into the gated community.
There we go.
Right? He would open the gates. Let them eat cake.
He wants what's best.
The Marie Antoinette analogy is not lost on me, and I, again, for the purposes of my job security, will have no further comment on any of this.
David Hale, thank you so much, good sir. It's always a pleasure catching up with you, and we appreciate your insight. Have a wonderful evening. I'll talk to you again real soon, sir.